We are going to introduce our speaker for today, and Rosalina, take it away with the introduction for Hala Khouri.
Hi everyone, welcome. I will be introducing Ms. Hala Khouri, who has an MA, SEPT, and ERYT. She has been teaching yoga and the movement arts for over 25 years and has been doing clinical work and trainings for 15 years. She earned a BA in psychology from Columbia University and an MA in counseling psychology and an MA in community psychology from Pacific Graduate Institute. She is currently working on her doctorate in community psychology with an emphasis on liberation studies and eco-psychology. Hala is trained in somatic experiencing, a body-based psychotherapy that helps resolve trauma and its symptoms. Hala is a co-founder of Off the Mat, Into the World, and a training organization that bridges yoga and activism within a social justice framework. She leads trauma-informed yoga trainings nationally. She has been in private practice for 10 years, working with individuals and couples. So join me in welcoming Hala.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for that. I'm so happy to be here. And let's see. So I was asked to give you all a framework of how we talk about trauma. And a lot of my work in the last several years has been bringing a critical lens, especially to mental health organizations and nonprofits that are serving folks who've been underserved or in the margins for a while, and helping folks work from a framework that acknowledges that trauma is not just personal or interpersonal, but rather there are other levels of trauma that have to do with the systems that we're a part of. And so what I want to do is start by sharing this framework with you, but also make sure to offer some physical somatic tools for working with our own self-regulation. So before I go into that, I'm going to invite us all to just take a moment to check in with our bodies right now. So if you need to shift your position for a moment, if you want to like roll your shoulders, just take a moment to tune in. You might close your eyes to do this. Just notice how you're feeling in this moment. Start by noticing your sensations, areas that feel tight or loose. How do you feel in your gut or your heart or your throat? And try to let go of any judgment. Just rather stay curious. What am I feeling right now? What am I feeling right now? And take a moment to let yourself get grounded. So by grounding, it can be as simple as paying attention to the parts of our body touching the ground or your chair. You might feel your back against your chair or your butt on the floor. Notice if you can find that sense of grounding, and when you do, if you found it, if the body settles at all. It's really hard to work for justice if we have alarm bells ringing inside of us, right? If we are really anxious inside or really shut down. So on a very personal physiological level, finding a sense of that grounding and that regulation allows us to do this very important work. And then notice your breath and try deepening your breath a little bit. We all have different ways of regulating ourselves. Some of us, grounding really works. For some of us, breathing can let us settle. Some of us, a little bit of movement. Like I'm a mover, so I just started rocking my body unconsciously. So check that out. If you're a mover or you just want to try just a little bit of movement. Just noticing for you if there's something in particular that allows you to settle, to feel a little bit more present. And maybe not. Maybe you're having one of those days that just feels really hard to be present, and that's okay too. And that's okay too. All right, so with that, now I'm going to pull us back up into our neocortex to gather some information. And then we'll come back into some of these tools. Tessa was able to share with me some questions that came out of the class those of you that are in class together. And so I have those as well to address. And a lot of those were really about those specific tools for regulating ourselves. And so hopefully I'll get to all of that today. So I want to start with just giving you a broad definition of trauma. So, really this lens that I'm offering is, what often is called a trauma-informed lens, although I'm more partial to a healing-centered lens. But trauma-informed tends to be a little bit more of the buzzword in nonprofits and in certain communities, and it allows some people access to the work. And I want to say that, like, trauma doesn't necessarily break us. Trauma is what shapes us. And so when I'm talking about trauma, I'm not just talking about pathology or limitation. I'm also talking about possibility. So the overarching definition of trauma is that it's anything that overwhelms our capacity to cope and respond. And it leaves us feeling helpless, hopeless, and out of control. And so a trauma is not necessarily in the event itself, but in our response to it, right? Two people can experience the same event. To one person, it's overwhelming, and to the other person, it's not, right? But our response to that event can dictate whether we get overwhelmed by it and traumatized by it in a negative way, or if it's not something that overwhelms us. And I want to give us 3 buckets, and again, holding for that these are things that shape us, and that we're often, if you think about your own life, think about the things that have shaped you the most, right? A percentage of those things will be challenges, right? There's positive things that shape us, like the love we got from our family and community, our culture, our healing practices. And if you reflect, I would imagine that for a lot of us, it was also things that were difficult that we had to overcome, right? Things that were difficult we had to sort out. And so difficulty shapes us, sometimes for the better, sometimes not so much, right? But I want us to keep that view as we are looking at the different types of trauma. And again, this framework is meant to give us a framework so that when we talk about healing justice, we have an analysis of trauma that is holistic, okay? So I'm diving into it quickly because I don't have a lot of time, but hopefully that sets the framework. And I wanted to say that if you do have questions, you can type them into the chat. We will be doing Q&A at the end, but if it emerges a little bit more organically for us to be pausing and dialoguing about specific pieces, feel free to type into the chat or hit the raise hand icon so you can ask your question. So I love when these are more conversational and interactive as well, okay? So the first type of trauma, the first source of trauma is shock trauma. And shock traumas are things that we typically think about when we're talking about trauma. Things like, the definition is it's an event that happens to us. It happens too fast and too soon, and it overwhelms us. So things like violence or witnessing violence or car accidents or even medical procedures or death of loved ones. These are events that are overwhelming that we have to endure or deal with, okay? And I want you to notice what's happening in your body as we're talking, because we know this trauma is here, it's amongst us. We've all had to face different types of trauma. And so if you notice your body getting activated, try to use one of those tools and maybe grounding yourself or taking a breath, right? Notice how you're feeling in your body. I'm not going to dive deeply into the details of really traumatic events and get you all overwhelmed in this talk. We're really going to try to focus on the framework here, okay? Developmental trauma is caused by a misattunement between a child and the primary caretaker. So with developmental trauma, one doesn't necessarily look back and say this bad thing happened to me. It's relational. And of course, with developmental trauma can come shock trauma, like if a child is hit, right, if there's physical abuse. But even without the shock trauma, lack of attunement is really overwhelming to children. Human babies are born 100% dependent on the attunement of their primary caretakers to survive. And if our caretaker is not able to attune to our needs, it's going to feel like life and death. Now, ideally, a baby cries and the caretaker comes to the child, What do you need? Are you hungry? Are you tired? Are you cold? Are you wet? Babies have very simple needs typically. But imagine that the caretaker is depressed, or the caretaker is anxious or has their own trauma, and the child cries and the caretaker either withdraws into the other room or the caretaker doesn't know what to do, right? Then that child might begin to internalize that the world is not consistent or safe, that their needs are not going to be met. Developmental trauma leaves an imprint on us that then we carry into our future relationships. And that imprint can take time to untangle. That imprint is around trust, bonding, the availability of connection, our own worthiness. So I'm hoping you can feel sort of the different qualities of the two sources of traumatic events. And folks can have both for sure. The reason it's important to make distinctions around the source of trauma is because then we make distinctions around the source of healing. Okay. So the last one I want to mention, and we'll pause for a moment here, is systemic or institutionalized trauma. And this is a really important category when we're talking about racial justice, healing, oppression, and power. And this is the part that's often left out in mental health paradigms. And this has to do with the trauma caused by unequal access to resources based on your race, your gender, your ability, religion, sexual identity, etc. This has to do with bias and discrimination. People who live with the stress of systemic oppression, systemic structural violence, are experiencing trauma. And when paradigms don't name this, then there's a sense of blaming the individual for a normal reaction to an overwhelming circumstance. When we locate the problem just in the individual, we dehistoricize them and we put the undue burden on individuals having to deal with their own traumas. So I'm going to pause here for a moment just to kind of hang out with this idea, right? That a paradigm must include the ways that we are cared for, our proximity to resources. And when we don't do that, again, there's an undue burden on individuals to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, to figure it out on their own. This is that, the American dream, exceptionalism, which we see a lot right now. I've been seeing this a lot in political discourse, right? And so when we're doing work around healing with a justice paradigm, this analysis becomes really important. So I'm just going to pause for a moment, see how folks are doing, and see if there's any questions or comments so far. And I can see most of you. You can raise your hand, or you can type it into the chat. Okay, we're good so far? All right, excellent. Oh wait, okay. So once again, reiterating, right? I love this slide. A diamond is just a piece of charcoal that handles stress exceptionally well. So as we are thinking about the different folks dealing with these different situations, we also want to think about the ways that we build resilience every time we have to deal with something difficult, or the ways that we can build resilience. Oftentimes people dealing with systemic oppression have had to be super resilient. There's a great saying that I heard once. It said that people who are underserved have had to learn to do more with less, right? So we want to be cautious when we are having this conversation, both to not imagine that the folks who have not had to deal with any systemic oppression are like perfectly healed and have had no difficulty, right? You can be somebody who's like won the identity lottery. You know, you're like a straight white man, able-bodied, wealthy. Doesn't mean you don't have PTSD. Doesn't mean you didn't endure extreme suffering in your household, right? That you don't have personal or interpersonal trauma, right? Similarly, if you're somebody who's on the lower end of the totem pole structurally and institutionally, doesn't mean that you didn't have a really supportive family or a very depthful spiritual practice to support you, to buffer you against some of those harms. So I think this is important because this is not about a competition about like who's got more trauma, right? Who's got more resilience, which can sometimes happen in social justice spaces. It's about creating distinctions that allow us to see the humanity in everybody without minimizing the impact of these larger forces on us, okay? And so this idea of resilience, right? The few definitions of resilience here. Resilience is our ability to recover from adversity. It's often defined as our ability to bounce back, which I don't love because a lot of people I work with are like, I don't want to go back, right? Like, I don't want to go back to how things were, right? But rather, maybe it's about being able to be transformed by difficulty. Resilience also has to do with a feeling like we could handle difficulty should it arise. We're all living into some imagined future, whether we know it or not. And one of the things that unresolved trauma does is it robs us of our capacity to imagine things being better than they were or that they are. Robin D.G. Kelly wrote a book called The Black Radical Imagination, and he talks about that it's the artists, it's the visionaries that are going to take our movement forward, that we do have to have an analysis of the problems, but if we get stuck in that analysis, we're never going to be able to move forward. And, I've been thinking about this a lot lately when it just feels like the world is in complete chaos and there's not a ton of evidence for hope. I've been thinking about how can we allow ourselves to feel the pain and the possibility at the same time. Like, let's not let the moment rob us of our capacity to dream something better, because when we have lost that, then we're going to be trapped by our trauma. So, this is why I also love somatic practices, because the more that we can carry in our own nervous system the complexity of pain and possibility, hope and despair, the more that we can build this resilience, right? We don't want to bypass the difficulty and pretend it's not there. And we also don't want to lose our capacity to imagine. And how do we think about imagining as a radical act of resistance? And I think that we want to also be cautious to not use the imagining to bypass the difficulty, right? And so sometimes I'll see this happening in yoga spaces or spiritual spaces where there's a wanting to deny the difficulty just to get to the dream, just to get to what we want. That also doesn't work. And so this paradigm asks us to hold all of it together. Hold all of it together. And to me, that's really what resilience is a feeling of being able to imagine, but also being able to feel what we're feeling. On a somatic level, and I don't have time to go into the full paradigm, but on a body level, one of the things that the research shows and the somatic experiencing, which is the technique that I'm trained in and I work with, shows is that we have to be able to release the energy from our bodies of a traumatic event, right? So that in order to release the stress and the stress and trauma from our body and our mind, we have to discharge this energy. And so part of regulating ourselves, right? So our body is our instrument, right? So we can have this right analysis, but if our instrument, our body and our nervous system is not able to hold the complexity of this pain and possibility, is not able to be present, we're not going to be able actually to participate in a paradigm that is healing. Oftentimes, like in the trainings that I offer, we find that we usually get a range of folks that come to these embodied social justice trainings. We'll get folks who are really dedicated yoga practitioners, and they have these like excellent diets and they take good care of themselves, right? But they're unwilling to step off their mats, so to speak. My nonprofit is called Off the Mat Into the World, right? So some folks get stuck in the healing practice to the point where there's a low tolerance for confronting the pain. There's such an investment in just wanting to feel the rainbows and the sparkles. And usually you have to have a certain amount of privilege to be able to be in denial of the pain of the world, right? So on one level, we'll get folks that have enough privilege to get stuck on their mats or on their meditation cushion, right? And they know they need to venture out. But on the other end, we get folks who've been out in the world doing justice work, organizing, being activists, or being on the front lines of mental health issues. And they've they've lost their connection with themselves. Their nervous systems are so burnt out that they've got compassion fatigue, that they're bitter, that they actually begin to replicate the problems that they want to push against. We often see this in nonprofits, even nonprofits that are doing important community work, that if we're not detoxing the traumas from our bodies, if we're not detoxing dominator culture from our bodies, we will replicate it, even if our work is about not replicating it. So we want to do the work personally in our own nervous system and our own psyche. We need to do the work interpersonally with how we relate with one another. And we need to do the work systemically. Now, I'm not suggesting like all of you have to do all of that. Each of us has to find our peace. Each of us has to find our peace. And what I think is important is whatever piece you're doing, we want to have this broader analysis. I know for me, a lot of my work developed out of my work with incarcerated youth. I was teaching yoga to incarcerated girls here in Los Angeles at Central Juvenile Hall. And I was bringing the trauma work into yoga class because there was so much trauma in the room. And when I first started doing this work, which was over 20 years ago, I didn't have a grounded systemic analysis of what was going on. And so I was just walking in, helping folks regulate, talking about, anger and emotions. And as I started to open up to this analysis and realize these girls are being incarcerated on prostitution charges. Who are these girls? These are Black and brown girls, right? These systems are screwing them over, right? They should be angry. Like, who am I coming in telling them somehow they should be regulating their emotions? And I really had to reflect on, am I part of the problem? Am I part of the problem coming in and subtly saying to them, if you regulate better, you're going to be able to control your impulses, and then you're not going to do things that get you into trouble, right? If I am even subtly setting that message, what am I doing? I am perpetuating this story. Especially these girls are actually victims of a system that is criminalizing their behavior, right? And so that for me, that's when I realized that if I don't come from this larger analysis, I am perpetuating a story that everybody has this individual will. These girls, their white affluent counterparts were not in juvenile hall. They were getting therapy. They were getting support. They were being told, you're a victim, you're a survivor, let us help you, right? So all these pieces have to come together when we're doing healing work. And for those of us doing the work more on the justice activism end, the personal work on reflecting on our own traumas, what has shaped us, what has shaped what we can and can't see is really important. So I'm going to invite you all for a moment to reflect on in what has shaped you without going into anything overwhelming. Which of these buckets has shaped you the most? Is it the shock trauma, Is it developmental? Is it systemic? Just reflecting for yourself. Maybe it's only one. Maybe you're like, I've had it pretty easy, except gosh, I had this really bad car accident as a child and I think it's impacted me, right? Or, I had a parent who dealt with mental health issues and I have some developmental trauma, right? Some of you might know what systemic trauma is like. If you're dealing, if you're in a Black or brown body or a transgender body, or you're differently abled, or you're not neurotypical, right? Or you've dealt with religious bias and persecution. Just right now, just check in with yourself, right? Think about where you've been shaped. And notice what happens in your body as I invite you to do this. Make sure you stay connected to your breath and to your sense of grounding. And the other thing I want you to reflect on is if there is one of these categories that is not part of your lived experience, this might be a place where you actually need to learn about those experiences, right? Learn through reading books and watching documentaries and talking to people, because if it's not your lived experience, it's something you're going to need to learn more about, right? And even where it is your lived experience, your experience is not going to be the same as everybody else, right? But I know for me, I didn't know about my light skin privilege until I learned about it, right? Like oftentimes, especially in the places where we carry privilege, We don't know because we haven't had to know, right? I haven't had to know what it's like to be discriminated against because of my skin. I know what it's like around gender, right? So especially in the places where we carry privilege, those might be places where we're unaware, okay? I often use a pretty simple example of like, how many people here are right-handed, right? If you're a right-handed person, have you ever thought about like scissors and doorknobs and car doors and knives? I never thought about that stuff. Why? Because the world is oriented to right-handed people. I never have to confront something that's not oriented to me. Do we have left-handed people on the call? Maybe a couple, right? So take a moment to reflect on that, because my hope is that when that you leave this talk with some places of curiosity about places where you could learn a little bit more. So I'm going to show you a few more slides that we can open up to some discussion. Everybody good so far? All right, excellent. So when we're talking about social justice, right? So post-traumatic growth, yay, right? We can be made strong from all this stuff. I want to give just some of the equivalents with shock trauma, right? So when we're talking about larger structural issues, shock trauma from a systemic lens has to do more with intentional and brutal acts of oppression. So things like genocide or slavery on collective levels, or hate crimes on the individual level, okay? Somebody had asked from the class before about intergenerational trauma, right? So we do want to think about what we are carrying from our ancestors as we're reflecting on the things that have shaped us. Because those practices of healing get passed on, as well as responses to trauma. On a developmental level, we can think about more implicit or invisible acts of oppression. So like educational or employment discrimination, microaggressions, unchecked biases, right? So these are places where you're not seen for who you are, right? There's assumptions. And so again, you can see that even within shock and developmental, folks are experiencing them because of systemic issues and cultural issues, right? And this again is going to shape us. So when we talk about ancestral trauma, we want to reflect on what might be passed on from our ancestors. And again, not coming from just a deficit place, right? What healing practices did we get from our ancestors? And what particular survival strategies did we get from our ancestors? So oftentimes, unprocessed trauma that happens to groups as a collective can get coded as culture. We can think about these as cultural practices, but maybe they're also a trauma response, right? So I know in my culture, I'm from Lebanon. We left because of the Civil War. And I never knew this, but like my mom was a hoarder. Like you go to her house, she doesn't throw anything away. She's got like money stashed in the cabinets, food for days, right? People that escape war, right? That's a behavior, right? It's something I've had to like undo in myself. Like I often feel this, like, I mean, if you like, wherever I go, there's like food in my purse, like Tessa knows, right? Like you're never gonna go hungry if I'm around, right? So that's a survival strategy, right? And so there's a strength in that, but there's also a level of anxiety and vigilance that I've inherited, right? From my ancestors. So thinking about cultural and ancestral trauma is important because some people might not have experienced particular things in their lifetime, yet their nervous system is already primed for trauma. There is some research. Somebody had asked about trauma being passed down through DNA. There's a little bit of research on Holocaust survivors and how the children of Holocaust survivors tend to have a physiology a little bit more primed to a traumatic response. Now, this is adaptive because if you lived through genocide and your offspring are going to be prone to be more hypervigilant to violence, they're going to be more likely to survive another genocide, right? The bummer is if they're not in a genocide and things are safe, but then they're hypervigilant to violence, right? Then that's going to show up as anxiety, right? For no reason. So we will inherit these survival strategies, and sometimes they're useful and sometimes they're not, right? Sometimes they just are going to cause anxiety for no reason because there's not a place to put it. And so, as you reflect on your own family of origin, right, that can be another interesting thing to reflect on is, what were you taught about survival in your family of origin, whether it was explicit or subliminal, and how might this be a product of what was passed on from your ancestry? Most of us, when we look back, can find in our ancestry either oppression, either being perpetrators of oppression or victims of it, right? And both are a form of trauma. Both are a form of trauma. There's a concept, and I think this comes from the veteran community, but there's a concept called moral injury. And moral injury is the damage done to one's conscience or moral compass when that person perpetrates, witnesses, or fails to prevent acts that transgress one's own moral beliefs, values, or ethical codes of conduct. So if we did have ancestors who were perpetrators of slavery, genocide, harm, there's an injury there as well. So often when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about folks who've been oppressed. I think it's important to add within that the trauma of being an oppressor, because in order to dehumanize somebody else, we have to dehumanize ourselves, right? That's really the only way oppression gets perpetrated and keeps happening, is our own dehumanization. And this is, again, a really important thing in healing justice paradigms, because it's so much easier, obviously, to empathize with survivors, right? But what's the work that we're going to do with perpetrators, right? Because if we don't actually do that work, then what can happen is, then the survivors just flip and become the perpetrators, right? And again, I'm not suggesting, if you are a survivor of a particular trauma, that you need to go work with perpetrators of that trauma, right? That may not be your work specifically, right? This work happens in community, and we all find our peace. We all find our peace. And so thinking about the trauma on both sides is really, really important. And I think about Audre Lorde, who, and I have this on a slide, she says that the true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations that we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within each of us, deep within each of us. And this is where the work of reflecting on ourselves, reflecting on our own motivations is so important. And for me, this is what I think about when I think about healing justice work. Healing justice work requires us to do the work of healing ourselves, being integrated ourselves as we work towards the pursuit of justice. We don't want to get overly caught in the navel gazing, right? And we want to be in this reflection and action praxis, right? We reflect, we act, we reflect, we act. And these are not new concepts necessarily. But a healing paradigm requires us to be doing our own healing work so that we're not participating in the harm of others. And the last thing I want to say, and we'll open it up, is one thing that I had to reflect on in my clinical training as a therapist was, at one point I realized that a lot of people became therapists because we just wanted to attend to the pain of others, and we didn't want to actually attend our own pain. Like, I know this was true for me. Like, since I was a kid, was always everybody's caretaker. I'm the oldest sibling. I took care of my younger siblings. When I was younger, my friends were all people that I took care of. And because I felt so comfortable in the role of caring for others, I was drawn to a profession of that, right? But subconsciously, I had to come to terms with that. I also didn't want to have to look at my own shit. Like, it was much easier for me to take care of other people who were struggling. And I realized that if I didn't address that, I would secretly be invested in other people continuing to struggle because I would need them to need me and I would need to feel like the healthier person, right? I think about this in justice work all the time. I think about like how smug and self-satisfied I feel when I like see somebody like acting overtly racist or like not getting the analysis right. And I'm like, ugh, look at me. Like I kind of like this feeling, right? I have to admit to myself the ways that I can be maybe invested in being right. And that the truth is like, if our work is really going to work, we're going to be unemployed soon, right? Like, we're not going to have to do anything. Like, are we willing to not be needed? Like that actually, if it's going to work, our ego can't be invested in it in that way, right? So I know this was really quick, but I'm hoping that you can see that I often say that a trauma-informed framework is a people-informed framework, that it's about understanding our own inner workings as we are engaging with others, so that we can actually move forward in our move towards justice. I was having a conversation this morning with a friend about vaccinations, and which is a hot topic right now, and it's become very political. But I was saying to her, you know, when I first had kids, I was like, I can't vaccinate my kids. That sounds awful, right? But I don't know anything about this. I'm not a doctor, right? I just had this feeling. And I remember my sister who works in the medical profession, she had so much judgment. She looked at me and she goes, oh, it was like she made me feel so ashamed for saying that I didn't feel like I could ask her to tell me more because I didn't know, right? I had done research. I found confirmation bias, research that confirmed my bias. And I was going to make this decision. And my sister just gave me this like look. And I was like, felt so ashamed. But then I also felt self-righteous. Like, well, look at her. She's not open. I'm not going to vaccinate my kids. And I had a friend who sat me down and said, tell me more about why not. And I said, I read this research and this research. And he said, let me show you other research. And we talked through it. And I realized, oh, I'm wrong. I need to change my mind, right? But if I hadn't had somebody patient enough to tolerate my different view, I would have never actually gotten with this one in my understanding. There is pretty much a better view, right? And so I've been thinking a lot about my lack of tolerance for people that have different political views, right? And where is our work? When is our work to actually stay regulated enough? I'm going to breathe, I'm going to ground so that I can actually engage. And when am I going to shut somebody out because I can't tolerate the ways that they're different? So think about this work as bridge building work as well. So I'm going to pause for a moment and just see for you all questions or comments or pieces of this, how it's landed. And I still have some of the questions, I have them written down here from the class from before, but I will pause and see what you all have. I'm seeing a question here. How do we teach these somatic skills, but also avoid falling into the trap of just teaching resilience instead of dismantling systems of oppression? I find this to be tough as a psychologist in the world of education interventions. For example, my field is always talking about teaching kids grit, but not about making schools anti-racist. Any advice on shifting others to move past the Band-Aid solution and see the deeper systemic wound? That is such a good question that I have chills. I do a lot of work in schools and a lot of work training teachers. And when I do the work, I try to, when I bring in the paradigm, so before teaching the skills, I talk about the paradigm and I have people include this systemic paradigm as well. And so I start with, we have to think about building resilience, and we have to have a critical analysis of power and oppression so that we're not just blaming the victims, so to speak. So depending on the capacity that you're working in, so if you're working as a school psychologist, like it's part of, how do we build it as part of psychoeducation with teachers? And also how do we build it into the school? So I see trauma work as anti-racist work, but I, historically never got called in to do anti-racist work at schools. I got called in to do trauma work. And so that's what you're asking me for. My motto is, sell people what they want, give them what they need, right? So some of us bring the work in a little bit on the down low. So I think that's my short answer. And I think that like really educating the teachers and the staff, which again, if you're, depends on the role that you're playing. But yeah, so it sounds like that's helpful for you. That psychoeducation is really important. Yeah, thank you for that question. Anybody else?
So I think Hala, well, first of all, thank you so much. Take a sip of your water, and everyone, maybe we can take a breath together just to let all of that incredible information land in our minds, our political analysis, our bodies, our hearts, our spirits. So that was very informative, educational, inspiring, and deep, right, on all those levels. So thank you for that, Hala.
And I know it's a lot.
It's a lot. You kind of got in the whole thing in a very short period of time. And also there's so much more depth we could go into. So Rosalina has some questions from the students in the class, and then we'll open it up also more broadly. People can put questions in the chat. We have about 15 minutes left. So Rosalina, do you want to facilitate the student questions?
Sure. I actually didn't receive any questions. We tried to do it over break, but I don't think anyone saw the message.
Okay.
So I think we could just open it up.
Okay.
And then whatever questions Hala has from the last class, she said, I think could be addressed.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have some of the questions from before. Do you want me to address those? Or I see Dominique with a hand.
Yeah, if it's okay to go. Hi, thank you so much for this talk. I found it really interesting, and yeah, it's really nice that you come and talk to us. So no, I had a question about, the work that you do in general, like healing practices and in social justice kind of like environments. I think generally I would imagine that you need a certain degree of openness from like participants and from people that you've worked with. And so I was just wondering if you have ever experienced like through your work kind of this like barrier that sometimes people put, and like definitely from different cultures where people don't, I find it hard to like find a way to put it correctly, because I don't want to say like don't accept the trauma they've been through, because who are we to say that they've been through trauma, but I feel like in some cultures it's more difficult to work through this. So I'm just wondering if you've had experience with this and how you kind of go about approaching it.
Yeah, I think that we have to meet people where they are. So before offering information, I'm usually asking questions. I'm asking people about their experience. I'm asking them about their concerns so that I can begin with where they're at. So I feel like you're alluding to, like you said, certain cultures where people are like, we're fine. That's not trauma. It's not part of our, and especially, I don't know if you're referring to this, a little bit more collectivist cultures, right? There's a little bit more, like I know in the Middle East and Lebanon, we're very like collectivist. Everybody's always together. So we don't talk about difficult things. We just pretend it's fine, right? In certain cultures, there's a like, we're not going to talk about it because we're always together and it's way too awkward and we're going to pretend like everything is fine. And so in some cultures, there's a little bit more of that. We have to meet people where they are. And that's going to look different based in the different cultures that we're working in. And I think focusing on assets, some people don't want to be told right away, like to your point, you have trauma, this is a problem, right? It's more like, what strengths did you get? Like, I never want to push people to identify as a survivor if they're not ready or if it doesn't serve them in the moment. And I do sort of trust that with connection and with offering information, folks will take what they need. It's not always at the pace I would wish for them or my own agenda. I always have to reflect on my own agenda. And especially folks that have had to deal with a lot of oppression, like they survived by like overcoming it, right? And that defense is also a really important part of their survival. So trying to pace things at the pace, moving at the pace of trust is something I think is so important and is really our only option when doing healing work. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else? And I do have some questions written down we can go through. Clayton.
Hello. Thank you so much for speaking today. It was really nice to hear the person who wrote like these really cool readings that we got to do for class. Something that like really resonated with me in your piece was you talked about like I'm trying to look where you actually articulated, but just like the concept of like this feeling like it was like time famine or something like that, I think. Was that what it was? Or like where you feel like you're constantly like checking your watch and you're constantly like on the clock, you're pushing for deadlines, you're like working in this like, I don't know, the way I see it is like this like 7-day cycle of like time due dates, like checking your watch. And so like if that is in a sense like how our world is functioning, like how do I as an individual, and then also like thinking about how like I can also affect my communities to think about it differently, like change or even just like survive in a system that's like constantly asking me to like hurry up, like go a little bit faster. Cause like my whole life, I think I feel like I've always been told to like move quicker, and I hate it. So like what can I do to like cope with that, I guess?
Yeah. And this might be related to also this idea of like productivity. Like if we're not productive, it's like the ableism in culture, right? Like if you're not always producing, you're not valuable, right? And so, I think that like pushing against productivity culture is really important if we can, right? If we have an opportunity to like slow down and push against it. And I would say, and I don't think that was something that I wrote in that reading, but I would say reflecting on our identity and how much we've internalized the sense that we are only valuable if we are producing, reflecting on the roots of that, right? So if that's the roots of that for you, reflecting on that, right? And reflecting on like how we might build communities and relationships that push against that. So I don't know if that's helpful, but like, I know I think about that all the time. I feel like I'm always rushed, always trying to get to the next thing. And the other thing is that we also get addicted to a certain level of stress because our nervous system gets used to running at a particular pace, and it can actually be scary to slow it down. And so also looking at the ways we perpetuate it because we're used to that pace. I'm a person who moves really fast. I always overextend myself. And I realized that like actually slowing down is more confronting. I'd rather be distracted by my busyness because then I don't have to feel. So I have to always be slowing myself down for that reason. So hopefully that helps, Clayton. Great.
Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else? Let's see, we have something here. What methods or activities do you find best for engaging younger children in healing practices, particularly in the age of Zoom? Teaching a social justice class over Zoom to elementary schoolers. Oh my gosh, yes. Well, Katie, I have elementary schoolers, and he wants to do nothing with the healing practices. I tell him, honey, I'm an expert. Do what I say. No. Getting kids engaged in their bodies, especially through movement, is so important, right? And so I don't know how you teach elementary schoolers over Zoom because I can't even manage mine in real life. So like bow down to you. But I think especially with the younger kids, we teach through storytelling and imagination, right? They're not as interested in being like directly how I feel in my body and what's going on. They're working with image, imagination, storytelling, songs and music. And so keeping it really creative is usually the best way in. And then finding, different ways to move the body, like in silly ways, I think that's not my area of expertise, but that's basically the best practices that I know with working with younger kids. And especially if kids are challenged, oftentimes they're not going to directly tell you that. You're going to get it again through story, through drawing, through art. They'll process those feelings. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else?
I'm curious if you can share some of your other favorite somatic practices. Like what do you, I know you're very rooted in yoga, but what other things do you recommend?
Yes, let's do a few. Shall we do some together? Okay.
That sounds good.
Yeah. So So one practice that's kind of nice for grounding, that's a really simple one, and you all could try these and see if they work for you, is to take your hands and gently just squeeze up and down your arms. And I just want you to notice if there's any settling or if you take a deep breath. Some of these will be nice for you and some of them might not do anything for you. And if you notice that you took a deep breath or settled by doing this, see a couple of nods. So this can be a grounding practice, right? Just a simple squeezing of the arms. Another one that can be interesting is tapping. And so if you want to try this, take your hands and just 4 or 5 taps on the top of your head, going out to your temples, underneath the eyes, up to your third eye, forehead, out to your jaw, and you're just kind of noticing anything that happens in your body while you do this. Center of your chest. You can take your thumbs to your side body. And then just release your hands and notice. Notice if there's any settling, a little bit more spaciousness in the body. And then of course there's working with breath. You know, the thing with breath is sometimes, especially if somebody is feeling anxious, trying to breathe deeply can actually trigger anxiety. So breath is an incredible tool, and it's important to notice if you're offering it to somebody and it doesn't look like it's working, to not kind of force them or like insist they keep trying to work with breathing. You can work with grounding a little bit, okay? Somebody's asking about older generations. Okay, I'll pause before I get to that question. So there's, you know, and then there's more active things, of course, which I don't know that we have the space to do, but like you could get up and you could shake things out. This is a good one with little kids. You just wiggle it out, you shake, shake, shake everything, right? But what's amazing is that, like, and I don't know if you all even are able to tune into it now, just simply taking a moment to do this or to tap or to check in can be settling. Now, for some folks, it's gonna be activating. You know, for some folks, it's like, I haven't felt anything all day and now you're slowing me down and whoa, my anxiety is gonna skyrocket. And so it's really important in the different groups you're working with, if you see that, to just have compassion. So it's always, when I go into spaces, especially if I'm working, say, at a nonprofit, and it's not like folks who like are familiar with yoga and especially folks that are under a lot of stress, there's always going to be 1 or 2 that find what I do very irritating, because it's just going to be too much to be asked to feel and to slow down. And I don't judge those folks at all. I'm not like, oh my God, look at them, because they often will act in a way that can look disrespectful. They're rolling their eyes, they're kind of shuffling their papers, they don't want to do it. But I have empathy of, it's a lot to be feeling. And so I will also name that, like, if this just is unpleasant, right? You might need to get up and walk around and move. That to actually be still can actually bring up the difficult feelings, okay? But I love the squeezes, I love the taps, breath work. Another one that I love is just put 1 hand on your heart, 1 hand on your solar plexus. And just try it yourself right now and see what it's like. If it's settling at all. And I often try to remind people that these tools aren't going to make everything go away, but sometimes they allow us to be with what is with a little bit more ease, right? Yeah, so I hope that those were helpful. And what I find, you know, in the different contexts folks are in, right? If you're in a school, in a community center, just having folks stop and, you know, we start a meeting this way. We take a few breaths. We acknowledge that we're in these bodies having these experiences. Yeah. I'm seeing another question here. What about older generations? I feel the key to dealing with matriarchs and patriarchs is the community are the champions to address or propagate generational trauma. How should we engage trauma rooted in culture? Is that in the unique ways their culture heals, or how can we embed healing in it? Oh, that's a really big one, John. I'm not too sure how to heal it. I mean, I think the first part is looking at what practices already exist within that culture that are healing. It sounds like you're also speaking to the ways that harm might be getting perpetuated in the name of culture by some of the older generations and how to break that. And so it might be about also recruiting the younger generations to examine that. But that's complicated, right? When you're especially looking at like culturally embedded practices, that some of them can perpetuate harm, right? And so I would imagine that takes a lot of relationship building as well. Yeah. So I see we have just a couple more minutes. Tessa, I don't know if you have anything before we close, but is there any other questions or anything?
Looks like we have one last quick question.
Yep. When practicing yoga and other trauma healing practices, how do we decolonize the way dominant mindsets still persist while paying tribute and honor to ancestors who have sustained and brought this work today? Yeah, and that's, I often say that there's so many indigenous practices that are about healing trauma, right? And folks were literally being killed for their healing practices. And now we're trying to reclaim them as like neuroscience is catching up to some of those old practices, right? And there's ways that those old practices were problematic as well. I also don't want to idealize, right? The way that your patriarchy and domination also lived in some of those cultures. So, I think that it's complicated. I think that speaking to the roots, so yoga coming from India and the practices being rooted in a different culture, attribution to that is really, really important. And also seeing them as living practices that are evolving and healing. So I'm always in relationship with folks who are trying to, holding me accountable for the different practices. And then also really opening up to practices that might come from some of the cultures that your ancestors come from, right? We all have indigenous roots somewhere. I mean, and if you're white, your roots are just further removed from you, right? Because colonization was wiped out so much of that, right? But how do we get curious and even broaden our field of healing practices, but continue to get educated and also pull resources and attention to folks from the cultures that what we might be borrowing from. And I think a lot of it is about learning about the cultures and being cautious. I know that I'm always growing and evolving with how I am using yoga as one of the tools that I'm bringing to people, for sure.
Well, Hala, thank you so much. If everyone can give it up for Hala and give her some Zoom love through the ether. And I know, I imagine folks join me in this sentiment of just feeling very full in heart, mind, and spirit as a result of all of that you shared with us. And very grateful for this time together. I really appreciate everyone joining us today. If you came on late or if you want to share this with others, the recording of this will be posted in a few days. And also Hala has a ton of wonderful things that you can do, small exercises and yoga classes and all kinds of stuff that you can find halakhouri.com. And there's a lot of resources there. And so I thank everyone for being a part of this. I really thank you, Hala, for your time and energy here. And yes, if you want to catch up, we do this series almost every Tuesday for the semester, and it's CASA Pitzer, C-A-S-A Pitzer. You could just type that in and find our events page, and you will find future events and recordings of past events. So thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you, Hala, so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for having me.